Hello, everyone, and warm virtual welcome to our alumni, friends, and all who share a passion for voting rights, civic participation, etc., who have joined us today. My name is Miranda Menard. I am a proud triple duck, most recently graduating from the Lundquist College of Business in 2021 with my MBA. And I currently serve very proudly on the University of Oregon Black Alumni Network Executive Board of Directors. As we gather today in this virtual space, I'd like to express my deep appreciation to all of our UOAA members. Your support makes an event like this possible, and we're truly grateful for your commitment to our Duck community. And today, of course, we will be examining the importance of voting and civic participation, specifically within the Black community. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded and emailed to everyone afterwards, along with a post-event survey. So please take a minute to give us some feedback so we can continue making meaningful content for you all. Additionally, this webinar is in dialogue format with some prepared questions, as well as the questions that y'all submitted during registration. That being said, I encourage you to continue the conversation by submitting any additional questions you might have in the Q&A feature below. With that, on behalf of the University of Oregon Alumni Association and the University of Oregon Black Alumni Network, it is my pleasure to introduce this special faculty webinar featuring Dr. Chandler James, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at the University of Oregon. Dr. James specializes in American politics with a focus on the U.S. presidency and public opinion. His research has been published in the Presidential Studies Quarterly, and he has provided expert commentary on national politics in the Chicago Tribune, BBC News, the Associated Press, USA Today, The Conversation, and many other outlets. He received a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago in 2023. So please help me welcome Professor Chandler James.
Hey, happy to be here.
Good to have you. Before we dive into a whole bunch of conversation, I would love to hear just a couple of fun things about you. So, what is your favorite spot on campus?
My favorite spot on campus is the art museum, the JSMA. I am a huge lover of the arts and particularly painting. I'm a painter myself. And so I just love to go into the JSMA sometimes and just kind of sit and kind of enjoy or experience the ambiance of being around such beautiful art objects.
Yes, I love that. I recall during my time at the U of O, the cafe there was like the space to study, and it was beautiful space. I love that. Well, yes, Dr. James, we are super excited to have you here. Um, Again, before we dive like super deep into things, what originally sparked your interest in political science, specifically the U.S. presidency?
I worked on Capitol Hill as a congressional staffer after college, after I graduated college. And uh, I had always been fascinated by politics and not only the kind of theoretical aspect of it, but the practical aspect of politics. And so I wanted to jump in and try my hand at participating in our governmental experience. And so I worked for my local congressman and actually ended up getting promoted to Washington, D.C., and spent a lot of time on the in the U.S. Capitol, getting a firsthand experience of what our legislative experience was like, and the nature of how bills are passed and how policy is made in the United States. And what I quickly came to recognize is that the center of action in our political system um, is with the US presidency at this stage of American history. The presidents are tremendously influential in terms of their cultural impact, but it's also the case now that presidents play a central role in determining the future of our country. And so that experience intrigued me, and I was very much interested in trying to understand the nature of the presidency and what qualities um, allowed someone to become president, and furthermore, like what explained the nature of presidential power, like why had the president obtained so much power vis-a-vis Congress over the years. And so that, initial interest really developed into a deep curiosity that I pursued via graduate school.
That's very cool. That's very, very cool. And so as you've transitioned, of course, from, DC, Capitol Hill to, the academic side, what aspects of your research are you most interested in?
So I am an academic and you see all these books. I love to read kind of a wide range of text, and so much of political science is increasingly scientific, mathematical, but there's myriad theories and perspectives in which to understand political phenomena that scholars have developed over the years, from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, up to the current day, where we're using kind of big data, AI, and statistical methods to try to understand politics and the political process. The thing that is of interest to me, though, is to bring these tools that are, effective means to understand how things work, the relations between things, to the practical politics, the real politics that I experienced on Capitol Hill. And so my object as a scholar and as a teacher is to take these kind of highfalutin ideas that are developed in the academy and translate it to kind of meaningful action, to understanding for people like my students, to people who I can share this my expertise with, but also on a kind of scholarly level. How can I try to make sense of real politics, and then explain it in such a way that people have a better understanding about what's really happening in their system of government. So I liken my role as something akin to writing a manual for a car, but my manual is for the presidency. I really want to be able to evaluate the presidency and then write in such a way that people can look at it and feel enriched, feel like they know the presidency better, and how the government works better, having read my work or took a class with me, or just heard me talk about politics in things in forums like this.
I love that. I love that. I'm gonna request that Shannon from the UOAA, when you send the follow-up email, if you could include a couple of Dr. James's most recent works, or works that you are proud of or want us to read, because I personally am very interested in diving more into that. That's awesome. So right, we're here to talk about civic engagement and voting. So why does civic engagement and voting matter, and does it create change?
So we are lucky enough to live in a democracy. And when you live in a democracy, what that means is that the people decide how things run. In other forms of government, say dictatorships or monarchies or oligarchies, aristocracies, a select few people determine the course of the nation. They make policies that everybody else has to follow. Policies, laws, things like that everybody else has to follow. In some countries, it's just a small band of party loyalists and one dictator that control the entire apparatus of the state. Here in the United States, we get to choose our leaders, and the fact that they are up for regular election means that we can hold them accountable. If they don't do what we want them to do, then we kick them out. We vote new people in who align with our values, with our vision of the future. So voting is incredibly important in our democracy because it determines who's elected. Like the people who are serving as president, governor, senator, the people, and then presidents appoint folks to executive agencies, the cabinet secretaries, judges, Supreme Court judges are nominated by presidents and then confirmed by the U.S. Senate, another group of people that we vote in. And so whether it's a certain way that the Supreme Court voted on a particular court case, or the way that your county sheriff or local police department treats people like you, all that is greatly affected by the vote, like the voting patterns, the voting that happened in the previous election, in the previous elections. And so if we want to impact the political system, the laws, the policies, the courts, the judges, the police officers, the sheriffs, then voting is the way to do that, the chief means to do that in the United States. And why it's so important, why voting, not only voting, but civic engagement is so important is because if you don't vote, then that means somebody else's vote matters just that much more. In our country, voting is highly correlated with being white, with being wealthy, with being college educated, with having high wealth, high net worth. So so people who are poor, people who are people of color, people who are working 3-4 jobs, low paid, these are the people who are less likely to vote. Now, people say, they complain, the government doesn't speak to people like me. Well, that's a consequence of the electorate. The people who vote are the people who the elected officials are responsive to. And so it's no surprise to me if well-to-do people are disproportionately voting, that the government system is disproportionately responsive to their will, that the government serves the interest.
The government serves the interest and looks and acts on behalf of the people who are voting. And so this has been a long-standing issue in the United States. Originally in the Constitution, Black slaves were considered 3/5 of a person. They were not afforded the right to vote or to make money, but they were their kind of personage was accorded to white voters in the South. So, Southern plantation owners, white people were able to use their kind of numbers to advance the cause of kind of their interest at the expense of the people who are enslaved. And over the past couple of centuries, Black people, women, minority groups have worked to try to gain the right to vote and gain influence in our political system. And it was a long, difficult struggle that took many generations. And so it wasn't until the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act and some of the court cases where Black people were able to influence policy in the South and at the federal level. And that changed everything for Black people, fundamentally. It changed everything. You went from a system where you were lucky to get one Black congressman in an entire Congress, or like, a Black person getting invited to the White House was a scandalous affront in the 30s, into a situation now where we've already had a Black president before. There's a Black woman who is the Democratic nominee. There are Black people who are making good money in various positions of influence in business, in culture, in music, in entertainment, and all over the economy, Black jobs. This is directly tied to political power. It's being able to make sure that people who are living in this country have influence so that their interests are taken care of. And so the more influence that you have in our political system, the more that you can do to serve the interest of your particular community. So for me, it's a matter of being able to be able to bring the resources to bear to make your community better. And voting is a direct way that you can do that, but it's not the only way, because there are all alternative ways or modes to affect the political system. You can get involved by volunteering for a political campaign or for a local nonprofit. And these things not only kind of enhance your political influence, but they also bring you into closer community with the people around you. so that your community ties are stronger. And when your community ties are stronger and you're developing that kind of crisscrossing patterns of communication and network, folks are able to more effectively communicate what's wrong and share ideas that are good, right? So that the communities are stronger and richer. And then people are like, wait, if we bind together, we're able to solve this particular problem. And now we're not just necessarily dealing with problems, but we're dealing with the future. What do we want for our community? What kind of, where do we want to invest? And so I think that in terms of living the good life, having strong communities, voting and political participation, civic engagement are essential to advancing our interests long term. And that's just the way it is in our democracy.
Yeah, that's an incredible answer. And I'm going to pull on a couple things you said, because I think that the really good points, two things. One, we get to choose our leader. Like, that's so powerful. And I love the explanation that you gave. And then the second being, historically, our community, Black folks, were seen as being 3/5 of a person, right? And so question to you is, how do laws like, the 3/5 of a person, voter ID requirements, limited polling locations, gerrymandering, et cetera, how do those laws and policies impact underrepresented communities, specifically Black voters?
So with respect to the 3/5 clause, it's an abomination, right? It's America's kind of original sin. And we're still dealing with the ramifications of that language, of that mentality, of that culture in terms of social hierarchy, right? Where people, because of various, beliefs, think that it's okay, that it's natural that some people are really poor and some people deserve to have, the kind of life that they have, a wealthy life. And like, that's just ordained, but it's not. It's a consequence of government policy. It's like all our social relations are directly tied to politics. And so when we look back at the history of America and the relations between America and Black people, we need to kind of recognize and appreciate how these racist laws facilitated, enhanced kind of racist social relations, racist norms, racial hierarchy, and ultimately a caste system. So I would say that, for a long time, Black people were basically unequal in the eyes of the law. And that is kind of the loudest, clearest signal of one's kind of place in the world, right? If the law is saying that you're not worth anything, then like that is kind of a very strong statement by the society in which you live. And so, now since the 1960s, many of these, explicitly racist laws have been repealed or overturned and replaced with, in many respects, kind of more racially progressive laws. Much has changed. However, I think that these kind of voter ID laws, which, on the margins, will only, according to the research that I've encountered, won't stop a lot of people from voting, right? It's not going to be the difference for a great proportion of people, but what it is that it's the difference for the people who are the most vulnerable. It keeps them from voting and expressing their will. And I think that's the pernicious aspect of it, is that it's seeking to disenfranchise people who have the most difficulty in our society making a life, and saying like, you can't vote, right? Like you can't communicate your preferences for how the government should be because you don't have an ID, right? And that might be one person out of 1,000 or one person out of 100. It might be a statistically small number of people, but it says the values, right, of the community, that we want to try to make sure that you don't vote. If that's the intent, there's some kind of reasonable basis, I guess, for trying to make sure that people are who they say they are, right? That we don't want voter fraud, but I think it's important to make it easier for people to vote. And these particular laws, I think, reflect a desperate approach to keep people from voting, because they think that those people might not vote for the folks who want those laws, right? And that's not the way that we should be thinking about the construction of our system. We should be thinking about what's fair, what's right, and what's good, what's just. And so, I don't know if it necessarily, and there's some evidence to suggest that these laws can backfire, right? Because it makes people upset. The idea that you would try to restrict people from expressing their constitutional right. But, I think that it's just really important that people see past these restrictions and say, not get caught up in the idea that we're kind of moving back so fast, but more so just kind of thinking about, how do you want the future to look like, and how do you want to make people feel as they express their constitutional rights?
Absolutely. You've touched a little bit on, well, I mean, truly, the impact of voting and the opportunity we have as Americans to, choose our leader and those sorts of things. What is your insight on why voting is important in an election where voters may not feel or may feel uninspired or dissatisfied with the candidates?
Yeah. So in our system of government, we have this kind of a system in which there are single member districts, and the person who gets the most votes wins, right? And in a system like that, often it's a regularity. One of the few laws we have or basically a law in political science, Duverger's law, this notion that basically in kind of single member districts where people can only vote for one person one time, it will mean that there will tend to be only two viable parties, because if you're thinking about how to vote, what you want to do is pick the person who is the most viable person that you least dislike, right? And if you don't vote for that person, if you instead vote for the person who maybe you believe like more closely shares your values, maybe a third party, if you vote for that third party, then you might be contributing effectively to the election of a person that you dislike more, who's more viable than the third party, right? And so what it forces you to do is basically select what many people say, like the worst of two evils. But I think that is a real concern. Like, we should vote for folks that inspire us and speak to our values and our beliefs. And if we can't distinguish between the two candidates, then you're basically ambivalent, and like that might be a perfectly rational reason why not to vote for that particular candidate. But I think the way that I think about it is you're trying to influence the outcome positively. You want to move things in the right direction. And so even if people are dissatisfied with the status quo, maybe there's one candidate that's preferable to another candidate, even if there's things about both that you dislike. I feel like not voting is not the way to ensure that the candidates move closer to your preference points, right? So 30% of people, don't, or 50% of people don't vote in most of the time. In general elections, it's a little bit higher. In midterm elections, it's a little bit lower. And people may say, I don't feel connected to the candidates, and in many respects, that's that might be perfectly true given what they know about the candidates. However, by not voting, that is a choice, and basically you're ceding the decision to other people. And I believe that if say those people who decided that that's not worth voting, then if they decided, if they were committed, they could fundamentally alter our political system, our society, by electing candidates that do align with them and holding candidates accountable through the voting process, voting people out who are bad and rewarding people who are good. That is the chief mechanism to affect the political system. So that the way that I think about it is just using this one particular tool to shape to move the country in the direction closer to where you want it to go. Now, you can say, well, my one vote is unlikely to fundamentally alter the outcome of elections. And that may be the case in some particular elections, but in local elections, there are some races that really go down to just a few votes. And moreover, this is what I mean by civic engagement. So I am just one person, but I believe that we should vote and that we should, try to educate ourselves. And these are things that I express through my life, through my action, through my work, through the community, the organizations that I participate in. And you can really increase your influence by convincing people that what you want is what's good for them as well. And so I think that it's really easy to get nihilistic or kind of apathetic about the system, but I don't think that does anything. Harry S. Truman said something. He said, optimists are people who think something can be done. Pessimists never did anything for anybody. So I choose to remain optimistic. And I think that that's what we should do. In many respects, we could think of voting as kind of a prayer or a hope or kind of a touch into the future. Like, this is what I believe our country should be. And then sharing that message. And you know what? Like, you have more influence than you think. People listen to you. You have people who care about you and people who think very much about, who have a high opinion of you. And if you just shared like your authentic values and your stories, I think a lot of people would come to agree with whatever the thing is that you're passionate about. And then you can start a movement. And so I'm all about thinking about what can I do as a person to make the world a better place. And I think that if we bring that mentality not only to the voting booth, but into politics in general, this country will be so much enriched as a consequence.
Absolutely. I love your half or glass half full energy throughout the conversation. I really appreciate that. You mentioned influence and kind of how that impacts choosing the candidates that you select and whatnot. As we know, it's 2024. We rely on technology a lot. And kind of prepping for this panel, I found a study from the Pew Research Center that says that more than half of American adults get their news from social media. So, you also touched on influence. So I'm wondering from your POV, what role do you expect social media to play on the 2024 election? And how has social media impacted kind of voter influence and misinformation more broadly?
Right. So social media it rivals traditional media in terms of influence. I mean, and particularly among younger folks who get a lot of their news, as you mentioned, from social media. And I think that as we evolve as a society and social media becomes more ingrained, we're getting less histrionic about its negative influence. I mean, there are bad things about social media. But I think, for me at least, it's become a kind of fact of life. And you can get good information from social media. It's just that you have to develop discernment about who you're listening to. Like you can follow people who know what they're talking about, or you can follow people who are just spouting off. And so um, I think that in our environment, our media environment, it becomes this really, I think, is the value of the humanistic education, and why college is so important. It's not because college teaches you all the facts, all the right things that just off, you know everything correctly. I don't think that that's what college does. What college gives you is judgment and curiosity and a healthy skepticism and tools to do research, right? So if if something sounds fishy, you should think it's fishy until you get some very credible sources, multiple credible sources to validate this fishy thing.
Yeah.
Right? And so when I have my students write essays, they say a statement, and I'm like, cite your sources. Where do you get this from?
Mm.
Because I care about people's opinion, but I want it to be informed by something tangible, that's real, that's truthful. And so, I think that, there's misinformation on traditional media. There's misinformation everywhere because people profit from lying to folks. That's just the truth. However, we don't have to be we don't have to fall victim to the lies and the deceit and the misinformation. We can have we can develop our capacity to discern true things from, or reasonable things from, unreasonable things. And unreasonable things we should hold to a higher scrutiny. And there are sources that I think that one could go to that are better than other sources. So, I read, say, the New York Times, but I don't believe everything that the New York Times says. A lot of the stuff, a lot of their opinions I disagree with. And I read other things to kind of substantiate, but I'm not trying to read 90 different, different websites to try to get, some median opinion. I think generally certain organizations do good journalism, and I tend to trust them. I am a researcher, so I tend to trust researchers, particularly people who have kind of credibility within their field. Usually they are, they have publications, and there are people who are citing them, and there are some sources that are, I believe, more legitimate in terms of, if I were, I think of it in many respects in kind of probabilities. I'm a statistician in many respects. And so, we can never know anything for certain, right? Like maybe you know that you're the parent of your kids. There's maybe a few things that you can know. I experienced that. I know this for sure. This is true. But for other things, it's a spectrum of, credibility, and some things like I believe, but like with, 95% credibility or confidence. And then some things I'm like, I'm not so sure. And I believe that with 45% confidence. And so, depending on the decision that you're making, like if I'm like dealing with a health issue, right? Like I want to make sure that my doctor is, got a medical degree, they're validated that they've got good reviews. Like I'm going to the threshold of information that I'm going to need to act is going to be a lot higher because it's high stakes, it's consequential. And I'm going to really scrutinize the information that I get so that I can make an informed decision about my life. I think that and so it's okay for you to be like, I kind of believe that, and leave it at that, if it's not really relevant to you. And you should basically, treat life. This is how I operate in life, to try to simplify things. It's, for the things that are really important, I want to be really confident, and for things that are less important, I have less confidence. And like that's I'm more willing to I'm open to believing some things, and that seem kind of wacky, but I'm not going to bet my life on it. And I'm curious about it, but at the same time, like, for the things that really matter, I want to be really sure, and I want to make sure that the people who are bringing me this information have been rigorous and they've been thoughtful in their analysis.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love what you said about becoming curious and all of that while being in college. I think that's a great note and a reminder that University of Oregon has top-notch professors like yourself. I love that. Looking at time really quick, I'm gonna give you a question from the chat. In regard to the two-party political system, can you just kind of speak on that a little bit and give your insights on, how we're ever going to be able to kind of break through that, two-party system, and maybe what some of the impacts of that are?
Well, I think that I'm a student of history. I think it's important to just learn about what the parties are about now, and what they've been about in the last decade, and the decade before that, and the decade before that. Parties actually are really helpful in the voting process. They simplify information so that, like, if we know that a person's a Democrat, that's going to mean a certain set that, that's generally going to mean a set of things relative to if that person says, I'm a Republican, right? And so these parties, versus whether they say I'm a communist or I'm a democratic socialist, these parties are helpful in terms of providing voters information about candidates, particular, like, like, I'm a professor, like, I don't have time to read every single person's, legislative history and, on the entire voting sheet. Like, at a certain point, like, I've got to decide, like, what kind of ideology generally do I want for particular governance, systems. And so I just want to say that parties are helpful, and if you want to know, in the heat of an election, there's a lot of things that are talked about that, are fodder for the news, right? And speak to the kind of horse race element of campaigns. But that's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what's happening in government. Republicans do way different things in government than Democrats. That's just a fact. Like, the types of policies that they pursue, the types of people that they appoint, the types of ideology that its members have are fundamentally different than what Democrats are. So there is a definite choice between the two parties. But like like, when people think of the two parties right now, like, we're thinking about, Trump said this about Kamala, and Kamala's, hitting back with that. And it's like, it's speaking to the horse race element, not to, like, the fundamental different approaches that they will bring to office, in part because it's not that interesting to the mass public, right? It's more titillating to hear about that kind of conflict, name calling or kind of high level numbers. And instead of thinking, like, I talked to a number of staffers, including Valerie Jarrett, David Axelrod, Pete Roos from the Obama administration. So I kind of asked them, what is it like to be president? Like, what's happening? And they said, presidents, their main job is hiring people. So the president is just going to be hiring 3,000 to 5,000 people for jobs. Who do you want to be making all those hires that are going to be in positions that are going to affect you and your kids or your family, your friends? What, like, who do you want? I think that's the question. Not like, you know, I think it can get really superficial because that's what sells in kind of the media sphere. But what matters, what's consequential, is who's making FEC policies, who's going to lead the Consumer Protection Bureau, who's going to lead the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, who's going to lead the FBI, who are going to be the people that make policies in this. This is what matters, and it matters a lot. It really does, and it can fundamentally alter the course of American history. Who's president of the United States? By the people, by the people that they hire and the decisions that those people make, whom they hire.
Absolutely. Great response. Thank you. We're almost at time, so I will let you, Dr. James, have the floor if there's any last comments or insights that you would like to share to the group.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for taking the time to come and hear this and listen to this, because it's so important for our country, but I think in particular our community, to be engaged politically, because so many of the laws need to kind of be updated, retrofitted for the modern day, for where we're at now. And the more people who are like us, or young people, things like that, who are involved in the process, the more that's going to be reflected in policy, in the people who are elected, and ultimately in the way that our society is organized. And so when we're involved like this, and when we care about stuff like this, and then we go share that to our networks, it can mean a huge difference, not only to ourselves, but to the people around us. And so I just want to thank you for taking the time to watch this and participate in this. And I thank you for your great questions, and really just happy to be here.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Echoing everything you just said. Thank you so much for all of our attendees who joined us. And please be on the lookout in the next couple of days for an email with the recording of today's lecture. Definitely share it with your networks, because as Dr. James just said, we do have an influence and we can make an impact. With that, we do value your feedback. There will be a feedback survey, so I encourage you to take a moment and again, give us that feedback so we can continue to make programming that is meaningful for you and our community. But once again, thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening and rest of your week.
Thank you. Bye.